Hello YouTube. I've been sitting here reading the NHRA rules and regulations on drag racing. And under general regulations 1.2 engines, halfway down it says crankshaft centerline must not exceed 24 inches from the ground in any class except trucks. Well, that's a problem because without reading the directions or the rules, I built this thing so that we have a center line of 25 3/4 inches. That means we're 1 3/4 inches too high. What are we going to do about it? Well, we could shorten the engine mounts, and that's going to screw up the drive line and may have clearance problems. We could take some space out of our spacer blocks here, but that's going to screw up the steering linkage. I think what we're going to do is try to get the space back in several places. We're going to try new tires, smaller tires, and if we need additional dropping, we're going to shorten the engine mounts. Now, if we shorten the engine mounts, we have to be very careful of our drive line angles. So the first step is the tires. New tires aren't too hard to swallow because the tires that are currently on the gasser have been there for 9 years. They've never been down a track, but they're 9 years old, and I don't know that I'd want them down a track. So we have some new tires. We're going to mount them up and see how much we drop. With these new tires, we've lowered the front end to 24 7/8 inches. We have to lose 7/8 of an inch. The next place where you're going to look to lose height are in these motor mounts. Here's a close look at the front motor mount. Not sure how we're going to shorten it yet. Let's take a look at the back mount. This rear motor mount is something that we fabricated recently. I still have the patterns for the hoops that we made for the drive shaft. So I think what we're going to do is try to repeat that as our lower end of this rear motor mount. Another thing we have to consider is drive shaft angles and the amount of play we have in the yoke traveling into the rear of the transmission. We're going to lower this motor 3/4 of an inch, and it essentially shortens the drive shaft, but I think we still have plenty of play. We're going to remove the engine because it's easier to work on the motor mounts with the engine out. But we're going to want to be able to position the motor between the frame rails with the motor mounts out in the same position it would be in as if the motor mounts were there. To that end, what we got to do is take some measurements. We can't take measurements from the motor to the ground because once we pull the motor out, the chassis is going to raise. So what we have to do is take measurements from the chassis to the engine. It just so happens that if we lay a straight edge across this rear mount on the frame, it's exactly level with the boss on the transmission. So we don't even have to measure that. We can just use our straight edge here to get this in exact position. In the front here, what I've done is clamped a 3/4 inch piece of tubing across these braces. And I'll take a measurement to the top of the bolt for the harmonic balancer, and it measures 6 7/16. This is the rear transmission mount that we need to lower 3/4 of an inch. What we're going to do is rebuild it. And we're going to use the same kind of theme that we did with our drive shaft loop. Is we're going to make it rounded on the bottom. Now this is the template from this loop. I can't use it for this because the distance between the frame is different. So the first thing we got to do is take the mount out. Well, it didn't fall out, but maybe it'll slide out. This was our original mount. We want to follow this form. I've laid out a center line and a line that's exactly 8 7/8 inches away from this edge. That's the width of this. And what we're going to do now is create an arc. We'll take a compass, and what we need to do is find half the distance. So we'll go from the center line, the outside line, tighten it down. Make sure that we have enough room on the end. We'll mark that spot. Draw a 95 to that so we know where the arc should stop. Take our compass and put it in the punch mark and draw a half circle. And that'll be the outside circle of our loop. Now what we have to do is create an inside circle. The dry shaft loops are 1.5 inches wide. So we'll make this 1.5 inches wide also. And what we'll do is measure up 1.5 inches on our arc and punch it. Change our compass to that dimension and scribe another arc. We want the rails, the upright portion of the loop, to be 1.5 inches wide. So we'll scribe it for both our patterns at the same time. We'll measure down 1.5 inches from our width line and mark it. And 1.5 inches up, mark it, and scribe that line. The height of the mount is 3.5 inches, and we'll start our curve at the bottom of 3.5 inches. We want the height of the motor mount to be straight. So we want to have a 3.5 inch piece of straight transmission mount to mount right to the frame of the car. So let's measure up 3.5 inches. And we'll draw another line. And I'll hold this up and see if the reflection shows what we have. I hope you can see this, but what we have is an outline of what the hoop is going to be like and will be our pattern for the real thing. Let's start by cutting out the big chunks here with the bandsaw, but the curves I probably can't cut with a bandsaw. We have the pattern cut out so far as the width of it goes, and it fits between the frame the way it should. If I put this where it's supposed to be, which is 3 inches of straight before we start our curve, the bottom is way further down than what this one is. So what I think we need to do is raise it up a little bit and have the curve start before we reach the bottom of the bracket. And that's okay, because this one does that anyway. The curve starting before it reaches the bottom of the frame. So I think what we need to do is cut another 2 inches off the top of this to make this one match this. This is 12.5 inches to the ground. Now if I lop off 2 inches from the top of this, this will be 12.5 inches from the ground. I've clamped in place our pattern. And what we want to do is locate the center of the holes for the bolts that will fasten this to the frame. We have what's called a center punch, and it's a rod with a point at the end of it, and the rod is the size of the hole. So what we can do is slide that into the hole, hit it with a hammer, and it'll mark the center of the hole so we can drill it. This is what it looks like. We have nice punches where we need to drill our holes. We'll go drill those out before we remove this other material. My son tells me that that's the best way to drill so you don't distort the metal. Let's drill some 1/8 inch pilot holes. We'll use a step drill to drill out these holes to 3/8 of an inch. That's the size of the bolt. The step drill makes a little lip when you drill, so if we turn them over and go use the bevel the next size up, we end up with a nice hole. We've got our patterns cut out and bolted in. We have our patterns laid out on a piece of metal, and now what we're going to do is scribe it. And now that we've got it scribed, we'll take the clamps off. We have a nice outline, and we'll go cut it out. It's nice to have a bandsaw to cut the straight lines, but it won't cut the curves, so we'll resort to a jigsaw to cut the curves. We have the hoops cut out. I've drilled the holes, I've bolted it together, and we're going to grind it as one so we get a real nice finished product. Alright, that's looking pretty good. Let's smooth out these edges so nobody gets cut. And now we'll sandblast to get rid of the scale. Here we have the hoops out of the sandblaster. The only thing that's common between the new hoops and the old mount are the holes. The holes in the frame remain the same. So what I've done is measured down from the top hole to the bottom of the old bracket, and I've come up with measurements. The lowest measurement is 3.275, which is 3 1/4 inches. Now if we want to lower that cross member by 3/4 of an inch, we want to lower it by 3/4 of an inch, and it's currently at 3 1/4. If we add that together, we get 4 inches. So we want to drop our member to 4 inches. So if we set our micrometer 4 inches, it's off the hoop. So what we got to do is create a line here so that we can mark it on the hoop. So what we're going to do is draw a line at the bottom of the hole, right across the bottom of the hole, and we'll scribe. And now we'll measure down 4 inches, and we're on the hoop, and we can scribe that and do the same thing on this side. And this line represents the bottom of our new cross member. Now we'll check that by putting the old cross member here and measuring down, and we have 3/4 of an inch. We have the bracket in the frame. We have the cross member clamped in place. The bolts are free. If we measure our cross member, we have 1.5, and if we measure our frame, we have 1.5. That means the two surfaces are parallel to each other. We can scribe the end of our cross member and cut it off. We can now scribe our cross member and cut it. What we have here is the old transmission bracket, transmission mount, and the cross member to the new transmission bracket. What's missing out of the cross member are the holes to mount the transmission mount to. If you note, they're not in the center. So what I've done is drawn a center line on our bracket that corresponds to the center line of these bolts and then marked off the distance in between so we can drill some holes. But we don't want to just drill holes for a bolt, because if we tighten this up, we'll crush the tube. What we're going to do is put in some heavy wall tubing and then put the bolt through the heavy wall tubing. That way we can't crush it. We've drilled some 3/4 inch holes, and our sleeve fits snugly into that 3/4 inch hole, and now we have to cut them off. Here we are welding the sleeves in place. And now some grinding to make it look pretty. We'll put a nice little bevel on our holes. Here we have the cross member clamped in place, and we have the transmission mount bolted to the cross member, and we're checking clearances of the transmission mount to our new bracket, and we have plenty of clearance. The next thing will be to put it on the car and get all the holes lined up. We have the bracket in place and all the bolts are free. If we put a protractor on it, it measures 1.4. And we put a protractor on there and it measures 1.4. I think we're ready for welding. Here we go. We got everything clamped in place, and I'll put a tack in each corner so I can remove the clamps and finish welding. And finish welding. This is the side of our transmission bracket, and I've cut little pieces of metal to plug the ends of the 1x2 tubing. So it's time to weld. And this is what it looks like when we're done welding and grinding. And this is what it looks like cleaned up and ready for powder coat. And that's where we're going next. Here's the new transmission bracket. It's all powder coated and bolted in, and we're ready to try the engine. The transmission bracket is in. We have clearance. Let's see how far we lowered it. If you remember, when we laid this ruler across the frame here, it was even with the boss on the transmission. Now it's 3/4 of an inch down, so we did lower the back end at 3/4 of an inch. Well, I think we accomplished what we wanted to do. We've lowered the back 3/4 of an inch. We've lowered the front 3/4 of an inch with the tires. I've simply run out of time on this video to do the front. I'll have to do that in the next video. If you enjoyed this video, there'll be more.